The air in Alastair Finch's land office was thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke and superiority. It clung to the heavy draperies that blocked the harsh afternoon sun, and it settled on my worn dress like a second layer of dust. I stood before his polished mahogany desk, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white mountains on a barren plain. I was 25 years old, a widow of 6 months, and in their eyes, I was nothing more than a stray dog to be shooed away or, if they were feeling generous, thrown a meager bone. Mr. Finch leaned back in his creaking leather chair, a portrait of practiced patience. He steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his gaze dismissive as it swept over me. Beside him, leaning against a bookshelf filled with titles he'd likely never read, stood his lackey, a man named Peters, whose smirk was a permanent fixture on his face. "Adeline," Mr. Finch began, his voice a low rumble of condescension. "We have been over this. The parcel of land your late husband left you is, forgive my frankness, worthless. It is baked clay and rock. Nothing has ever grown there. Nothing ever will." He gestured with a soft, manicured hand toward a document on his desk. "My offer of $50 is more than charitable. It is a kindness. It will give you enough to see yourself to a real city, to find proper work." Peters snickered. "More than Thomas ever got from it, that's for sure. Spent 20 years listening to the dirt, the old fool." My spine stiffened. A cold fire moved through my veins, but my face remained a mask of placid stillness. I had learned from my husband, Thomas, the power of quiet. Noise was for the uncertain. Silence was for those who knew. "The land is not for sale, Mr. Finch," I said. My voice was low, but it cut through the stuffy air. Finch's feigned patience evaporated. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Girl, do not mistake my charity for weakness. You are alone. You have nothing. That land will starve you before winter comes. Take the money." I looked past him, through the slit in the heavy curtains, to the bleached-out street where dust devils danced in the oppressive heat. I could feel the land calling to me, even from here. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, a pull Thomas had felt his whole life. "No," I said again, the word a simple, unmovable stone. The smirk fell from Peter's face, replaced by disbelief. Mr. Finch's own face flushed a deep red. He stood up, slamming his palm on the desk. The inkwell jumped. "Then starve," he boomed, his voice filling the small room. "Starve on your precious patch of dust, just like he did. Don't come crawling to me when you're begging for scraps." I did not flinch. I simply turned and walked toward the door, their laughter following me like a swarm of angry wasps. I was finished with them. I was finished with their world of loud noises and easy judgments. As I stepped back into the blinding sun, I felt not fear, but a strange and burgeoning resolve. They saw dust. Thomas had taught me to see something else. The walk back to the farm was long, the sun a merciless hammer against my head and shoulders. The town receded behind me, its boisterous certainty fading into the vast, humming silence of the plains. My home, if one could call it that, was a small, sun-bleached cabin that seemed to be slowly surrendering back to the earth from which it was built. It stood alone in a sea of cracked, rust-colored soil, punctuated by stubborn, thorny scrub and rocks that shimmered in the heat. This was Thomas's legacy. Not a fortune, not a thriving ranch, but this. 160 acres of what the world called failure. I pushed open the cabin door, the familiar scent of drywood and old paper greeting me. Everything was as he had left it. A tin plate on the simple table, a worn blanket on the cot, and on the small nightstand, his journal. I ran my hand over the soft, cracked leather of its cover. This was the other part of my inheritance. While the deed gave me the land, the journal, he had told me, held its true map. I sank onto the edge of the cot, the exhaustion of the day washing over me. In my mind, I saw him. Thomas. He had been 20 years my senior, a man with kind, crinkled eyes and hands as rough as bark. The town had always kept him at arm's length, whispering the names they had for him. The dreamer. The listener. Fool Thomas. They saw a man who would spend entire days lying on his stomach, his ear pressed to the baked earth, and they laughed. But I had seen something else. I remembered a day, not long after we were married, when I had asked him what he was doing. He had smiled, a slow, gentle thing that made his whole face light up. "I'm listening to its heart, Addie," he'd said, his voice soft as a breeze. "This land isn't dead. It's just quiet. It speaks a slow language. You have to be patient to hear it." He had never tried to force the land to his will, never plowed it until it bled dust, never cursed it for its stubbornness. He simply watched it, listened to it, and waited. Patience, he would say, is a kind of wisdom the earth understands. The men in town, like Finch, understood force. They understood profit and loss, the immediate and the tangible. They could not comprehend a man who measured wealth in the subtle shifting of stones or the direction of the wind. They saw a fool, and now they saw his foolish widow, clinging to his greatest folly. But as I sat there in the fading light, his journal in my lap, I knew I was not clinging to a failure. I was holding on to a promise. That night, by the flickering light of a single tallow candle, I opened the journal. The pages were filled with his neat, deliberate script. It was not a record of daily events, of harvests or sales, for there were none. It was a chronicle of the land itself. His entries were observations, small and seemingly disconnected, yet woven together by a single, powerful thread of belief. April 10th. The wind speaks from the west today. It carries the scent of distant rain, but the ground remains hard. It is not ready. It holds its breath. I traced the words with my finger, feeling the ghost of his presence in the room. He wasn't writing for anyone else, he was simply in conversation with the world around him. I read for hours, losing myself in his quiet, patient world. He wrote of the way the shadows of the clouds moved across the plains, calling them the dark ships. He noted the patterns of cracks in the dried mud after a rare shower, sketching them carefully, seeing in them a language I did not yet understand. And he wrote, over and over again, about patience. May 3rd. The world rushes. Men want their answers now. They strike the rock and demand it give water. They curse the sky and demand it give rain. But the earth does not bow to demands. It responds only to a deep and silent waiting. It gives its greatest gifts not to the loud, but to the quiet. There were no instructions, no clear directions for finding some hidden treasure. It was a book of philosophy, a testament to a way of seeing. The men like Finch looked at the land and saw a surface. They calculated its worth based on what it immediately offered. Thomas looked at the land and saw a depth, a history, a secret life unfolding on a timescale far grander than a man's ambition. I came across one entry that made me pause, the candle flame dancing in a sudden draft from the ill-fitting door frame. July 22nd. There is a thirst that water cannot quench, and there is a water that is not for every thirst. The land waits for the right thirst. It will show its heart only to one who asks with humility, not with a shovel but with their feet. I read the passage again. Not with a shovel but with their feet. It was a riddle, a piece of poetry, and yet I felt a jolt of understanding. He wasn't telling me to dig randomly, to tear at the earth in desperation. He was telling me to walk. To observe. To follow a path the land itself had made. I closed the journal, the weight of it feeling heavier, more substantial now. The town saw a fool's ramblings. I was beginning to see a map, drawn in a language no one else had bothered to learn. The next morning, I would begin to walk. I rose with the sun, the air cool and crisp before the heat of the day took hold. I did not take a shovel or a pickaxe. I took only a small canteen of water, a piece of dried bread, and Thomas's journal. I walked not with a destination in mind, but with a purpose. I was learning to see as he had seen. For days, my routine was the same. I walked the perimeter of the property, my boots scuffing against the dry, pebbled ground. I felt the subtle shifts in the terrain beneath my feet, the places where the rock was closer to the surface, the patches where the soil was softer, more forgiving. I watched the way the sparse vegetation grew, clustering in faint lines as if following some invisible guide. I sat for hours, just as he had, watching the way the light changed, feeling the direction of the wind on my skin. I was trying to unlearn the world's impatience. I was trying to learn the slow language of the earth. The town's ridicule did not cease. Finch's men would sometimes ride the edge of my property, their laughter carrying on the wind. Still listening for gold, Adeline, one would shout, and the others would roar. I never gave them the satisfaction of a reply. I simply continued my slow, deliberate pilgrimage across my own land. I was finished with their noise. My focus was on the ground, on the quiet truths they were deaf to. Then, on the 7th day, I found it. I was in the far western corner of the property, a place distinguished by nothing but a vast, flat expanse of sun-baked hardpan, a surface as smooth and unforgiving as a slate tabletop. I was about to turn back when I felt it, a subtle, almost imperceptible change under the sole of my boot. It was not a dip or a rise, but a vibration. A faint, low hum that seemed to come from deep within the earth. I knelt, pressing my palm flat against the ground. There it was again. A tremor so faint that if I had not been looking for it, I would have missed it entirely. My eye scanned the surface, searching for the source. And then I saw it. It was a crack. Not a wide chasm, but a hairline fracture, a dark thread stitched into the pale fabric of the clay. It was almost perfectly straight, running from a small outcrop of rocks and disappearing toward the horizon. It was so thin I could barely fit the edge of my fingernail into it. I stood up and began to follow it. It went on, a single, unwavering line across the barren plain. This was what Thomas meant. This was the path the land itself had made. I remembered his words, "It will show its heart only to one who asks with humility, not with a shovel but with their feet." I had walked the land with respect, with patience, and it had shown me its secret scar. I didn't know what it meant, not yet. But as I stood there, a lone figure under the immense, empty sky, I felt a thrill of discovery that was more potent than any fear. The earth had spoken its first word. Realization settled upon me as surely as the coming dusk. This was not a task I could undertake alone. The line in the earth was a clue, a beginning, but to follow it to its conclusion would require more than one pair of hands. My mind immediately went to Samuel. He was an old man now, his back bent from a lifetime of hard labor, his face a roadmap of sun and sorrow. He had worked for Thomas for a single season, years ago, before his rheumatism had become too severe for full-time work. Unlike the others, Samuel had never called Thomas a fool. He'd just shaken his head and said, "That man's looking at a different world than you or I." He lived in a small shack on the edge of town, tending a meager garden and keeping to himself. I found him sitting on his porch, mending a piece of leather harness. He looked up as I approached, his pale blue eyes squinting against the evening sun. He showed no surprise, just a quiet curiosity. "Adeline," he said, his voice raspy like dry leaves. I wasted no time on pleasantries. I told him everything. I told him about Finch's offer, about the journal, and about the crack in the western hardpan. I did not embellish or try to convince him with false promises. I simply laid out the truth as I had found it. When I was finished, he was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy mountains. I waited, allowing him the space for his thoughts. Patience. It was the first lesson. Finally, he looked at me. "Your husband was a strange man," he said, not unkindly. "He saw things. I remember him telling me once that the driest ground often keeps the deepest secrets." He ran a gnarled thumb over the worn leather in his lap. "You have no money to pay me." It was a statement, not a question. "No," I admitted. "I have nothing. But if this leads to something, if Thomas was right, I will give you a quarter share of whatever comes from it." He grunted, a sound of consideration. He looked at my hands, calloused and dusty, and then into my eyes. I did not look away. I think he saw in me not the desperation of a helpless widow, but the conviction of someone who had found her purpose. He saw Thomas's legacy, alive and fighting. "A quarter share," he repeated slowly, testing the weight of the words. "Most folks would laugh at a share of nothing." "We are not most folks, Samuel," I replied, my voice steady. A slow smile creaked across his weathered face. "No, I suppose we ain't." He set the harness aside and pushed himself up from the chair with a groan. "All right, girl. I'll help you chase your husband's ghost. My back ain't what it used to be, but my hands still know how to work. We start at sunrise. I felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled my knees. I was no longer alone. We were a meager army, an old man and a young woman, armed with little more than a dead man's cryptic words and a shared belief in the unseen. But as I walked back to my cabin that evening, the stars beginning to prick the velvet darkness, I felt stronger than I ever had in my life. The work was about to begin. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of sweat and soil. We began at the rock outcrop where the crack originated. Armed with 2 sturdy shovels and a heavy pickaxe Samuel had owned for 30 years, we started to dig. It was not a straightforward excavation. The journal had been clear: respect the line. Do not disturb it. So we dug a trench parallel to the fissure, a few feet to the side, chasing it across the hardpan. The work was brutal. The sun beat down on us relentlessly, and the earth was as hard as iron. Each swing of the pickaxe sent jarring vibrations up our arms. Each shovelful of clay felt like lifting a boulder. Samuel, despite his age, worked with a steady, relentless pace, his movements economical and practiced. He taught me how to use my weight, how to find the weaknesses in the soil, how to pace myself against the heat. He never complained. He just worked, his silence a comforting presence beside my own. We spoke little, conserving our energy for the task. Our communication was in the shared weight of a rock too heavy for one person, the passing of the water canteen, the nod of understanding at the end of a long day. The town did not leave us in peace. It became a form of local entertainment to ride out and watch the fools at their work. Alastair Finch came by more than once, seated comfortably on his fine horse, a smug look on his face. "Still digging, Adeline?" he called out one afternoon, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You'll reach China before you find a single dollar in that dirt." Samuel and I did not stop. We did not look up. The rhythmic scrape of our shovels and the thud of the pickaxe were our only answer. The sound of their laughter would follow them as they rode away, but it felt distant now, like noise from another world. We were in our own world, a world defined by the earth, the sun, and the thin, dark line that pulled us forward. Days turned into a week, then 2. The trench grew longer and deeper, a raw, red scar on the pale land. We were grimy, exhausted, our muscles screaming in protest each morning. There were moments of doubt that crept in during the quiet hours of the night. What if Finch was right? What if we were just 2 fools digging a meaningless ditch, honoring the memory of a third? But then I would open the journal, and Thomas's calm, steady words would anchor me again. The greatest treasures are not found, they are earned through devotion. The earth gives nothing to the impatient. This work, this sweat, this was our devotion. We were not just digging a trench. We were proving our worthiness to the land. We were showing it the depth of our patience. And so with every sunrise, we would pick up our tools and continue to follow the line, trusting that it was leading us somewhere worth going. We were nearly 300 yards from where we started, the trench now a testament to our stubborn persistence, when the sound changed. For weeks, the pickaxe had made a dull, thudding sound as it struck the compacted clay. But one afternoon, as Samuel swung the heavy tool, it struck with a sharp, resonant clink. The sound was so different, so alien in the muffled silence of our work, that we both froze. We looked at each other, a silent question passing between us. Samuel swung again, more carefully this time, in the same spot. Clink, it was the sound of metal on rock. Not the loose stones we'd been prying out, but something solid. Something vast. We abandoned the pickaxe and began to dig carefully with our hands and the edges of our shovels, scraping away the last few inches of soil. The clay gave way to a flat, smooth surface of dark, solid rock. It was a wide shelf of bedrock, extending as far as we could see in our narrow trench. We had hit the bottom. My heart sank. Was this it? A fool's errand ending at an impassable layer of stone? But Samuel, his face grim with concentration, was on his hands and knees, running his fingers along the hairline crack we had been following. The fissure did not stop. It continued across the surface of the bedrock, a tiny but perfect fracture in the stone itself. "It goes deeper," he breathed, his voice filled with a new kind of awe. He pressed his ear to the rock, just as I had seen Thomas do 100 times. He closed his eyes, his whole body still. I held my breath, the silence of the plains pressing in on me. After a long moment, he looked up at me, his eyes wide. "Adeline," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Come here." "Listen." I knelt beside him, placing my ear against the cool, smooth stone. At first, I heard nothing but the pounding of my own blood. Then, I let go of my own noise, my own anxious heartbeat, and I listened deeper. And I heard it. It was not a vibration this time. It was a sound. A low, constant, liquid murmur. A deep, subterranean song. It was the sound of moving water. Water. It was flowing, deep beneath the bedrock, following the path of the ancient fissure. We hadn't just been following a crack in the dirt. We had been following the scent of a hidden river. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and sudden, tracing clean paths through the grime on my cheeks. Thomas wasn't a fool. He was a prophet. He had listened so long and so patiently that he had heard the earth's deepest secret, a vast, underground aquifer, a river of life flowing beneath his worthless land. We had found it. We had found the heart of the land. The next few weeks were a blur of focused, feverish activity, but of a different kind. Our discovery had given us a new energy, a certainty that burned away all doubt. We knew the water was there, but we needed a way to reach it. Samuel, it turned out, had more knowledge than he had let on. In his youth, he had worked on a crew that dug wells, and he knew the principles of drilling through rock. It required tools we did not have and an expertise we could only guess at, but we were undeterred. We used the last of my meager savings to buy heavy steel chisels and a sledgehammer from the town blacksmith, who looked at us with pitying eyes but took my money all the same. Then, day by day, inch by agonizing inch, we began to drill. One of us would hold the chisel steady against the bedrock in the fissure, and the other would swing the heavy hammer. It was dangerous, painstaking work. A misplaced strike could shatter a hand. But we worked with a synchronized grace born of shared purpose, the rhythmic ring of steel on steel echoing across the silent plains. The town's mockery took on a new, confused tone. They saw our new tools, heard the constant ringing from our land, and could not comprehend what we were doing. But something else was happening in the valley. The long, hot summer had bled into an unforgiving autumn. The rains had not come. The creek that ran through the town was now just a ribbon of damp mud. Wells that had served families for generations were beginning to run dry. A quiet panic was beginning to set in. The ranchers, including Finch, were having to haul water for their herds from miles away, a costly and unsustainable effort. The land around us was turning from brown to a brittle, lifeless gray. Yet on our small patch of earth, a miracle was occurring. Close to the fissure, where a small amount of moisture seemed to seep upward through the stressed rock, a faint tinge of green was appearing. A few stubborn blades of grass, then a patch of hardy clover. It was a small, almost insignificant detail, but in the midst of the spreading drought, it was as vivid and shocking as a splash of green paint on a canvas of dust. Rumors began to circulate, whispers that old fool Thomas's widow had done the impossible. They were no longer laughing. They were watching. And they were waiting. The contrast was stark and undeniable. As their world withered, ours was showing the first, tentative signs of life. The day Alastair Finch came, the sky was a sheet of pale, hazy brass. The air was still and hot, thick with the dust that seemed to rise from the very soul of the parched land. Samuel and I were taking a rest, sitting in the shade of a canvas sheet we'd erected, when we saw the rider approaching. It was him. He was alone this time, without his smirking lackeys. He rode not with the arrogant posture of a man in charge, but slumped in the saddle like a man carrying a great weight. He stopped his horse a few yards away and dismounted, his expensive boots sinking into the dust we had spent weeks excavating. He looked at the deep trench, at the tools, at the small but vibrant patch of green near the fissure. He looked at Samuel and me, our clothes stained with sweat and dirt, our faces weathered by the sun. The arrogance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, desperate exhaustion. He held his hat in his hands, turning it over and over. "Adeline," he said, his voice raspy and low. He didn't call me a girl. He looked at the ground, unable to meet my gaze. "My wells are dry. My cattle are dying." He finally lifted his head, and I saw in his face the terror of a man who was watching his entire world crumble. "The whole valley is drying up. They say you found water." I did not speak. I simply watched him, my expression unreadable. I thought of the day in his office, the smell of his cigar smoke, the sound of his laughter as he told me to starve. I felt no desire for revenge. That was his language, the language of power and humiliation. I was learning a different one. "Is it true?" he pressed, his voice cracking. "Please. I need water. The town needs it. I'll pay you. Whatever your price." This was the moment of reversal, the scene I had never allowed myself to imagine. The powerful man, the cynic, the mocker, standing before me as a supplicant. He was asking for the very thing he had declared worthless, the secret of the land he had despised. He was finally learning the meaning of thirst. I looked over at Samuel, who gave me a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The decision was mine. "The water is not for sale, Mr. Finch," I said, my voice calm and clear. Despair flooded his face. He thought I was refusing him. "But it can be shared," I continued. "My husband believed this land could provide for everyone, not just for one man. The price is not in dollars. It is in respect. You will help us bring it to the surface. You and your men. You will work alongside us. And the water will be for the whole community, allocated fairly. Not just for the man with the most cattle." He stared at me, dumbfounded. He had come expecting to bargain with greed, but he was being met with grace. He had expected a price, and he was being offered a covenant. For a long moment, he was silent, the vast weight of his pride at war with the crushing reality of his need. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes," he said, the word barely a whisper. "All right. That was a long time ago. I am an old woman now, and I look out from the porch of a house that stands where the dusty cabin once did. I see a valley that is not brown, but 100 shades of green. The hidden river, our river, was brought to the surface, and it transformed everything. The trench we dug became the main artery of a system of aqueducts and irrigation channels that web across the valley, a testament not to one person's genius, but to a community's shared labor." Alastair Finch was true to his word. He and his men worked beside us, their sweat mingling with ours in the same soil. In that shared work, the old hierarchies of the town dissolved. He never regained his former arrogance, he was humbled by the land, and in that humility, he found a better version of himself. He learned to listen. We all did. The town, once on the brink of abandonment, thrived. It became a place known not for its gold or its cattle, but for its water, and for the wisdom of knowing where to look for it. My farm became the heart of it all, a place of counsel and community. I never sold a single drop of water. Thomas's journal sits on my desk, its pages worn thin from a lifetime of reading. His legacy was never about money. It was about a way of being in the world. He taught me, and through me this whole valley, that true value is rarely found on the surface. It lies hidden, waiting for those with the patience to listen, the humility to learn, and the courage to believe in what others dismiss as foolish. He taught us that the earth does not belong to us, we belong to it. And now, I speak to you. You, who may feel that you are standing on barren ground, that your inheritance is worthless, that the world has dismissed you as a fool. You may feel that your own life is a parched and dusty plain, with no promise of green in sight. Do not believe the loud voices of cynicism and doubt. Do not mistake the surface for the reality. There is a deeper life flowing beneath everything. There is a hidden river inside of you. Be patient with yourself. Learn to listen to the quiet language of your own heart. Walk your own ground with humility and devotion. You will find a fissure, a small crack of truth that no one else can see. Follow it. Do the work. Trust the process. The world may laugh for a time, but their noise will fade. And you will find a wellspring of strength and purpose so deep it will not only sustain you, but it will have the power to make the entire world around you bloom.